All right, let's just jump right in and demystify one of the absolute most powerful forces on the planet, which is group culture. I mean, we all know it when we feel it, right? We've all seen those teams that just instantly click, where 2 plus 2 somehow equals 10. And of course, we've probably all been in groups that add up to far, far less than the sum of their parts. So in this explainer, we're going to unpack exactly what makes certain groups achieve that kind of collective magic, and more importantly, how you can actually replicate it.
Our guide for this whole journey is Daniel Coyle's phenomenal book, The Culture Code. You know, we so often think of culture as this magical trait, like a kind of organizational DNA that you're just born with or you aren't. But Coyle spent 4 years researching top-performing groups, everyone from Navy SEALs to a literal gang of jewel thieves. And what he found is that culture is definitely not fate. It is a set of skills. And the impact is just massive. A Harvard study mentioned in the book actually showed that a strong culture increases net income by a staggering 756% over an 11-year period. Let that sink in for a second. 756%. It is an actionable process, and it absolutely pays off.
So here is our roadmap for today. We'll start off with the spaghetti tower surprise, move into skill 1, build safety, then skill 2, share vulnerability, skill 3, establish purpose, and wrap up with culture is in action.
Let's kick things off with a really classic experiment by designer and engineer Peter Skillman. It completely flips our expectations of who actually makes the best team. And honestly, the results are pretty shocking.
So, Skillman gave 4-person groups a super simple challenge. They had to build the tallest possible structure using uncooked spaghetti, tape, string, and 1 marshmallow, which had to go on the very top. Some of these groups were made up of brilliant, highly rational business school students. And others? They were just kindergartners. Now think about how these 2 groups behaved. The business students acted exactly how you'd expect. They strategized, they analyzed, they neatly divided up the tasks. But beneath the surface, they were caught up in what psychologists call status management. They were subtly trying to figure out who was actually in charge and tactfully critiquing each other. The kindergartners, on the other hand, barely talked at all. They didn't strategize. They definitely didn't waste time figuring out who the CEO of the spaghetti project was. They just stood shoulder to shoulder, grabbed the stuff, and rapidly started trying a bunch of ideas together.
And the outcome here just totally shatters how we usually think about group performance. The kindergarteners utterly dominated. Their structures averaged 26 inches tall. And those smart, sophisticated business students, theirs averaged a measly 10 inches. See, the kids didn't win because they were individually smarter. They succeeded because they worked together in a much smarter, more connected way, entirely without that massive friction of status management slowing them down.
So the real takeaway here is that culture is absolutely not about assembling the highest individual IQs in one room. It's all about interaction. As Coyle perfectly puts it, culture is a set of living relationships working toward a shared goal. That is exactly what those kindergartners did naturally. But the big question is, how do we actually recreate that vibe in complex adult environments?
Well, that brings us right to skill 1, build safety. When you ask people in highly successful groups to describe their relationships, they almost never use the word team. They use the word family. And that profound feeling of family, it comes entirely from safety. To really grasp the power of belonging, let's look at a crazy contrast from the military. Think about the Air Force Missileers. These are officers sitting in isolated underground bunkers. They endure this impossibly rigid, perfection-based testing where a single mistake will literally ruin their entire reputation. It is a perfect storm of anti-belonging cues. No physical connection, absolutely zero tolerance for error, and no shared future. You can practically feel the suffocating tension and paranoia, which, surprise, surprise, results in a highly toxic culture. Now compare that to nuclear submariners. They're handling the exact same immense pressure of nuclear deterrence, but they're doing it in close physical proximity. They are doing purposeful, active tasks, not just staring at screens, and they have clear, incredibly supportive career pathways. They are constantly surrounded by high belonging cues, and that builds an incredibly cohesive and trusting culture.
And safety isn't just some fuzzy vibe either. It is built through very specific, measurable behaviors. MIT researcher Alex Pentland found that these incredibly primitive communication factors are actually the strongest predictors of team performance. We're talking about simple things: high levels of eye contact, everyone talking and listening equally, and peers communicating directly with each other instead of routing every single thing through the boss. These matter more than individual skill. They matter more than experience. These constant tiny signals just keep telling our primitive brains one vital thing: you are safe here.
Now that we've established the glue of safety, let's move on to the muscle. Skill 2 is share vulnerability. This is exactly how successful groups translate that safe connection into dynamic, trusting cooperation.
Because here's the thing. Highly successful cultures are definitely not just happy, breezy places where everyone agrees all day long. Actually, they are intensely focused on solving really hard problems. And that requires uncomfortable truth-telling. So, how do leaders deliver high-candor feedback, like telling someone they need to completely overhaul their work, without just totally demoralizing the team? Well, they do it by actively modeling vulnerability themselves and creating a space where risks are shared. Let's look at the actual habits of vulnerable leaders. First, they eliminate bad apples swiftly. The incredibly successful New Zealand All Blacks rugby team literally has a no dickheads rule just to fiercely protect the team's cohesion. Leaders also show what Coyle calls muscular humility. Picture these massive, world-famous rugby stars physically picking up brooms and sweeping the locker rooms after a brutal match. It vividly shows that we are all in this together. They also capitalize on threshold moments. When Pixar brings on new hires, they put them right in the director's row on day one and say, "We need you to help us make our films better." It completely shifts the dynamic instantly. And crucially, they avoid that classic sandwich feedback method. You know the one where you awkwardly cram a criticism between two totally unrelated compliments? They don't do that. The human brain just gets confused by mixed signals. They separate the positive and the negative so that both the support and the necessary critique are crystal clear.
Okay, let's dive into the third and final skill, establish purpose. Look, purpose is not some mystical internal drive, and it's definitely not just a shiny plaque in the lobby. It's about creating simple, visible beacons that relentlessly focus everyone's attention on the shared goal.
But exactly how you build that purpose depends entirely on what your group is trying to actually do. Leaders have to tailor their approach because there are two very different environments. If your group is aiming for skills of proficiency, think customer service or manufacturing, where you really need machine-like reliability, you have to provide a vivid map. You need crystal clear directions and really memorable rules of thumb. But if your group relies on skills of creativity, like designing software or inventing something brand new, your job completely changes. You have to act more like you're supplying a crazy expedition. You vigorously protect their autonomy, you watch the team dynamics like a hawk, and above all, you make it incredibly safe to fail, over and over again.
And the best groups keep this purpose front and center using something very specific: catchphrases. Now, I know, to an outsider these can sound a little cheesy or even kind of cultish. But that obviousness, it's a feature, not a bug. Phrases like the San Antonio Spurs pound the rock or Zappos create fun and a little weirdness aren't trying to be high art. They are crisp, action-based nudges that constantly pull the team back in the exact right direction during those chaotic moments when decisions have to be made.
And it goes way beyond just words. High-performing groups pack their physical environments with actual artifacts. If you stroll into the San Antonio Spurs practice facility, you aren't just going to see some inspirational posters. You will see a literal, physical rock and a sledgehammer sitting right there behind glass. Over at Pixar, they have gleaming Oscar trophies sitting right next to these rough, heavily erased, original hand-drawn character sketches. These items aren't just quirky decorations. They are constant visual signals, shouting to everyone in the room, "This is what matters to us, and this is exactly how we got here."
So let's bring all this together with our final section. Culture is in action. We've clearly seen that an elite culture isn't magic. It is a living, breathing relationship built through very deliberate skills.
What you should really take away from all this is a fundamental shift in how you view teams. Culture isn't something you simply are. It is something you actively do, day in and day out. You build safety through constant small signals of connection. You share vulnerability to turn that safety into serious muscle. And you establish purpose through clear maps, simple catchphrases, and meaningful artifacts. So, as you look at your own team, or your family, or your company, really think about it. What actionable step is your group going to take today?